bringing you law, gospel, and guns. Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio.
Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode 34, brought to you by Cook's Holsters, American-made custom Kydex holsters with a 100% satisfaction guarantee and a lifetime warranty. CooksHolsters.com. Well, here at Armed Lutheran Radio, we talk about faith, firearms, the Second Amendment, gun rights, the shooting sports, and self-defense in light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining us today. Hope you enjoy the show. I've got a wonderful cast of contributors, and we've got a great show for you again this week. Before we get started, just a couple of bits of news. First off, I'd like to thank Paul Lathrop, the founder of the Polite Society podcast, for coming on the show last week and telling his amazing story. It was an honor to have him on the show. I devoted the midweek meditation exclusively to his interview, and if you haven't heard it, I would encourage you to go back and listen. There's a lot of great information there. Listen to midweek meditation number 4 called Win the Race to the Phone. Secondly, Armed Lutheran Radio and Mission 160 Tactical are hosting a one-day Fundamentals of Defensive Focus Shooting course. It's designed by Rob Pincus and taught by our good friend Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense. The class will be on Saturday, October 22nd in Whitewright, Texas. I'll have a link in the show notes where you can find out more and sign up for the class. The cost is $200, and if you use the promo code Lutheran, you'll save 20%. Sergeant Bill and I will both be there, and I hope you will come and join us. So let's see. What did I do with guns this week? Not much. It was a really crazy week at work, and I managed to get in just one session of dry fire and one range trip. I did manage to get my wife out to the range with me. She got to use her cool new pink camo holster and mag carriers from Cook's Holsters. I got some videos from Sergeant Bill that I do need to do some editing on and post for you. One of them is a drill called Call It or Leave It. And I ran that drill quite a bit at the range, and it is tough. It'll wear you out. A lot of running back and forth, seeing how many times you can hit a steel plate in 10 seconds. When I wasn't shooting the drill, I had my wife shooting at that steel plate. It's about an 8-inch steel plate, and she could not hit it from 10 yards to save her life. Everything was going left. I mean, she probably hit maybe 1 out of every 10 shots. Turns out that she lost her left eye contact lens, last one that she had, and she went to the range without it. And she had a heck of a time seeing much of anything. She was determined not to give up. And with a little coaching on sight picture and how to, hard focus on the front sight, she was hitting 80% by the end of the session. We had a lot of fun, and I was really proud of her for persevering and sticking with it. Anyway, I'm hoping to get in more practice this week because time's a-wasting. The battle in Benton is coming up in September 10th, on September 10th, and then Nationals follow the week after that. Now, what have we got on the show for you today? First up is Sergeant Bill, who will be discussing the pros and cons of different kinds of guns, the difference between the all-steel guns and the plastic fantastic guns. Aaron Israel is talking about how to teach your kids gun safety in his Fundamental Defense segment. Mia Anstine has tips for how to get the woman in your life involved in shooting. Guys, pay attention. And we'll be talking about the sin at the root of America's violence problem. And Pastor Evan Gegline is back with us. He'll be talking about how we can talk to our kids about evil, terrorism, gun violence, and cop killers. All that straight ahead, right here on Armed Lutheran Radio.
It's the Bill of Rights, not the Bill of Needs. I'm Alan Gottlieb, founder of the Second Amendment Foundation. When someone says we don't need that kind of gun, remind them the Founding Fathers determined what rights our Constitution should protect. There's a world of difference between rights and needs. It is not the function of government to tell us what we need or what we don't. Certainly no one needs an assault rifle or a Saturday Night Special, or for that matter, no one needs a Corvette with a high-capacity horsepower engine capable of speeds to 150 miles per hour. But in the hands of honest, responsible individuals, we have the right of choice. We have the right to read books others don't like. We have the right to listen to any radio program we choose. We have the right to dress the way we want to. We also have the right to own firearms of our choice. So the next time someone tells you you don't need something, tell them it's the Bill of Rights, not the Bill of Needs. Join the Second Amendment Foundation today so that this message and our Bill of Rights might live. Call 425-454-7012. That's 425-454-7012.
Time now for another Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill Silvia.
This is your Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill. Today's topic is going to be heavy steel versus light plastic guns. Okay, so heavy steel guns would be like your 1911s, your CZs, and all the CZ clones, Tanfolios, you name it, the list goes on and on. Your light plastic guns are your GLOCks, your M&Ps, your XD. You can even throw in a SIG 320. Usually striker fired, not usually, but they're the plastic frame, polymer frame, whatever you want to call them, plastic fantastic guns that have become very popular in the last 10 to 20 years. Here's my observations on the pros and cons of each one of them. All right, we'll start out with the plastic guns, your GLOCks and M&Ps, XDs, all those. All right, the pros of these guns. They are lighter for carry, all-day carry for, if you're concealed carrying them or duty guns or just shooting competitions. You're going to be carrying it all day long. They're quicker handling because they are lighter. You can transition faster, you can draw faster. They're usually cheaper to purchase. Well, because there's less milling work doing on them, and there's also, you don't have to mill the steel. You don't have to do a lot of the process you have to do with a steel gun or aluminum frame gun. You're just molding the polymer plastics, and it's just cheaper in the long run. I found there's a lot of less maintenance with them because they usually have a little bit looser tolerances, and the polymer guns don't seem to attract as much carbon and fouling as much as the steel guns. You just don't seem to have to clean them as often. They don't have any problems very often because they're dirty, filthy guns. All right, now the cons. The biggest one is the grips. They have a lack of texture and or changeability. Now, you could take your polymer guns, your GLOCK, and you can stipple the grips and permanently, or you can put some grip tape on there, some sandpaper or rubber ones or whatever you may be, a rubber sleeve. But it's really hard to kind of change the grippiness of the grip. And you can do it, but it's just not as easy as the steel heavy guns. All right, let's go into the pros for the heavy steel guns. Well, they're going to be much more stable with a sight picture when you're holding it at arm's length. Because it's a heavier gun, it's a little bit easier to hold it in place. They do have that interchangeable grips, so you can change the texture. You can change the width and the thickness of those grips, or thinness, for different hand sizes, or for carry, or whatever it may be. And that grip usually will be able to change it all the way around. And one of the biggest ones a lot of people carry or shoot in competitions, these heavy steel guns, is they have less felt recoil and less muzzle flip. Because of the heavier gun, you just don't have as much recoil or muzzle flip, and it's just plain and simple. If you're not big on trying to manage recoil, this is a quick, easy way to manage the recoil. All right, now for the cons. They're heavy to carry. They're carrying around all day. You're carrying a big old heavy gun. They're heavy for the transitions. They're a little bit slower on your draws because of that heavier chunk of metal that you're swinging around from your holster or from target to target. It's not a huge difference, but it is a noticeable difference. They're also more maintenance, more cleaning involved. Like I said earlier, the carbon and fouling and all that stuff tends to stick to the metal a lot more, and because of the tighter tolerances with the metal guns, it affects them more, so you have to clean them more often. And because of those metal frames and all the machining and hand fitting and all that stuff it takes to even make factory guns like that, they're much more expensive. So that's been your heavy steel versus light plastic guns. And this has been your Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill.
Hey, this is Chuck.
And this is Kevin from the Survival and Basic Badass Podcast.
And you're listening to our friend Lloyd Bailey on the Armed Lutheran Radio.
It's time for this week's self-defense tip from Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense.
Hey folks, this is Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense here with your personal defense tip of the week. This week I want to implore you as parents to teach your kids about gun safety, whether or not you have guns in the home or not. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, it stands to reason that you probably have at least one firearm in your house staged for personal defense, or maybe it's just a hunting rifle or something like that. But regardless of whether you had one in your house or not, it's pretty likely that somebody else in your kid's life, whether it's a relative, a secondary caretaker, a friend, whatever the case may be, is probably going to have guns in their house. So if you're a responsible individual, regardless of whether you're a gun owner, which you're probably both, I'm hoping in this case, listening to this podcast, you need to teach kids, especially if they're your kids, about gun safety at an early age. Now, when do you start that? Well, there's not any arbitrary age. I mean, my daughter's like 5 years old. She's been learning gun safety since she was old enough to understand that the stove is hot and you shouldn't touch it. She sees me with guns all the time. I'm constantly taking my gun off and putting it in the quick access safe. She sees me strapping it on to walk out the door in the morning. She's seen me go hunting. She's seen me load up all my guns into my range bag to go to the range. So I've been teaching her about gun safety ever since she was old enough to get it. And you got to decide as a parent or a caretaker when it is that those kids are old enough to learn about stuff. And that's your responsibility to make that assessment and to start teaching kids as early as possible. The sooner the better. Now, if you have guns in your house, they shouldn't be a secret to your children. I don't think it's a good idea to just hide guns or to just have them in your house and then be kind of a thing that you don't talk about. If you have guns for personal defense or just guns in general, whether you have them staged for home defense or not, your kids need to know that that's a thing, and you need to start teaching them about that gun safety. So what are some tools that you have? Well, the NRA has a program called Eddie the Eagle, and they're on YouTube. You can find them on the internet. You can order the DVDs, and a lot of local sheriff's departments actually have like an Eddie the Eagle mascot that you can get to come talk to little kids groups at church or even schools, depending on if you go to a private school. Even some public schools bring them out there. And what the Eddie the Eagle program teaches kids to do is basically if they're around a gun and there's not adult supervision, they're supposed to stop, run away, tell an adult, don't touch it, that sort of thing, right? Now that's great, and it's a great tool, but it doesn't go far enough in my opinion, because it ignores the reality that if you say, hey, don't touch guns, just like you tell kids not to touch anything, and you don't give them proper context for how to touch them, well, what are they going to do as soon as you're not looking and they have the opportunity because of curiosity, right? They're going to touch the gun. So you have to accept that that's reality and that that's probably going to happen. And instead of saying don't touch the gun, say, hey, don't touch the gun unless you're with an adult. And when you do touch a gun, this is how to safely interact with it. This is when it is appropriate to touch a gun, and this is how to appropriately touch it and keep it pointed in a safe direction and all that good stuff. And you can start teaching them those basic safety rules of keep the gun pointed in a generally safe direction whenever possible. So don't point it at other people. Keep it pointed in the safest direction possible. Keep your finger somewhere other than the trigger unless you intend to engage something, and understand that it's a weapon that if used negligently or maliciously could kill or seriously injure you or someone else. And you can start teaching them that at a very young age, out at the range, or especially if you're a hunter. You take them hunting for the first time, you can teach them that stuff in real time, and you can even show them what a bullet will do to an animal when you kill that animal for food, right? And you can say, hey, this is why we don't point guns at things we don't intend to destroy. That's why we keep it pointed in a safe direction, because this is what it's capable of doing as being that killing tool, right? So teach your kids about these gun safety rules as soon as they're old enough to start understanding it, which is going to be an age when you think they're responsible enough to start getting it. Usually when they can tell the stove is hot, that's going to be a good time to start talking about it. And not only that, I've talked about safe storage of weapons and keeping them in a safe and secure place and staging them appropriately when you have them for home defense. You need to be doing that. And not only that, you need to be discussing with secondary caretakers. If you're sending your kids to another person's house, even if it's a relative or something like that, you need to have that conversation with them about how they store their firearms. And if they have them in the house, how are they staging them? Are they secure? Do their kids understand gun safety? Have they talked to little Billy about gun safety so he's not going to say, hey, come look at my dad's gun? And if that situation does take place, what you hope is your kid's going to say, hey, Billy, I can't look at your dad's gun if he's not here. And if that doesn't take place, if they don't go tell an adult and refuse to look or touch the gun, if they do the right thing, well, if they don't, hopefully when they touch the gun, they do it in a safe way because you've taught them how to do that. Hopefully they keep it pointed in a safe direction. Hopefully they don't let little Billy point it at them because they understand that, hey, this is how you safely interact with guns. So you can hope they won't touch it. You can hope they'll tell an adult, but it's really better to teach them how to interact with it safely from a very early age. So that's my charge to you guys as parents out there in Armed Lutheran world, is to teach your kids about gun safety as early as possible so that we can cut down on these unnecessary and preventable child-related negligent discharges that end in somebody getting killed, because they're all things that can be prevented through education, and we're the primary educators for our kids, so let's be responsible and make that happen. That's your tip for this week. Thanks for tuning in.
The National Rifle Association's Eddie Eagle has taken that message to more than 15 million kids nationwide through a program endorsed by dozens of governors and state legislatures. And gun accident rates today are the lowest ever recorded. For 130 years, we've worked to put safety and freedom first. I'm Wayne LaPierre of the National Rifle Association.
Pistols, prayer, and potluck. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
I've been thinking about the nature of evil and original sin quite a bit this week. Coming up later in the program, we're going to interview Pastor Evan Gegline from Faith Lutheran Church in Rogue River, Oregon, to talk about evil and how we explain it to children. The violence in America's great cities continues unabated. Law enforcement seems clueless to figure out how to put a stop to it. Donald Trump bragged that he'd stop it if he gets elected, but offered no details as usual. We're going to fix it. It's going to be great. Yeah. Hillary Clinton's policies, on the other hand, focus on meaningless gun control that will only target the law-abiding. So, I don't know which is worse. It's going to be great. We're going to fix it. No details. Or stupid details. Last week, the cousin of NBA star Dwayne Wade, Nikea Aldridge, a 32-year-old mother of 4, was shot and killed in Chicago as she was pushing a baby stroller headed to school to register her children for school. The police commissioner of Chicago said basically what all of us have been saying for months. Enough is enough. We've all been saying it. But it's just getting worse. In August, 462 people were shot in Chicago alone. 90 of them died. That's a 66% increase over 2015. That ties a record that stood for 20 years. 449 people have been killed in Chicago alone this year. That's a 50% increase. Enough is enough. But how do we make it enough? The knee-jerk reaction to any act of violence, of course, is background checks. Gangbanger shoots up a party in Connecticut a couple of weeks ago. nerdy little Senator Chris Murphy comes out and says, we need background checks. Genius. 2 guys with very long criminal records, including convictions for gun crimes. They're felons, prohibited from possessing a gun. They shoot and kill Dwayne Wade's cousin. Yeah. Background checks. Now, I ranted about background checks a couple of weeks ago in my midweek meditation segment, so I'm not looking for a repeat performance here. What I want to talk about, though, is the real problem, and the one that nobody really wants to deal with because, quite frankly, it scares the crap out of them. We, in the gun rights community, talk about how guns don't kill people, people kill people. And while true on its face, this sort of glib statement misses the point. The problem is not people. The problem is sin and our understanding of it and how we deal with it. The 2 men who were arrested in connection with the killing of Dwayne Wade's cousin were not shooting at the woman that they killed. They were shooting at her driver. Why? Because they didn't like the way he looked at them. What gun control law, what background check is going to stop that kind of sin, that kind of wickedness? So why is this idea of sin, scary for some people to talk about? Well, for some, the admission that there even is sin, that there's a morality beyond just what's legal and what's not legal, is an admission that there might be God, and we can't have that. But that's not even in this awkward, horrible, secular America we live in right now. That's not the majority view. Many Christian denominations are adamantly in favor of gun control. Several years ago, I compiled a list of anti-gun churches, and I posted it on my website, and then it got reposted to a bunch of other sites without anybody attributing it back to me, so I just said to heck with it, and I took it down. So if you see that list somewhere, yeah, I'm the one who compiled it and put it together. I just didn't put it back on my site when I redesigned it a couple of years ago. But these are Christians, right? Surely they understand sin. You'd be surprised. For many, facing the idea of sin, and particularly original sin, is a little daunting. The Bible teaches us in Psalm 51 and Romans chapter 5 that we're born in sin. Mankind is inherently sinful. That is, we're without the fear of God. We don't trust in God, and we have an inclination to sin. Well, there are many, even among Christians, who believe exactly the opposite. They believe in the innate goodness of man, that sin is not part of our nature. It's just a sickness, something we can overcome, something we can cure. And therefore, the gun becomes just a talisman of evil, something that causes otherwise good people to do bad things. I mean, how many times have we heard the claim that, oh, Johnny was just a good boy. He loves people. He loves cats. He's not a bad person. After he, shot up a school full of kids. They don't want to accept the truth, and they'd rather blame something else, anything else, like the gun. But the person, the sinner, and his sinful nature are what's to blame, not the gun. The gun's just a tool. And that frightens many people who hold this view of man's innate goodness. The idea that we're not in control is scary. That sin is an innate part of who we are and we can't do anything about it. It's why we gossip. It's why we lie. It's why we cheat. It's why we think or say or write hurtful things about other people. It's the root of the envy that is the heart of the social justice movement and socialism. The problem is sin. For politicians, facing the reality of sin means speaking frankly about the culture that exists in our inner cities and the policies that created that culture. See, these politicians have made their careers scapegoating other politicians, other political parties, even an entire race. And they've called those who speak the truth racists. So for them to now embrace the truth and potentially be branded a hypocrite, that takes a special kind of courage. And let's face it, politicians are spineless. And they don't want to admit or accept that their policies are failures, or that their policies are worse than failures. They've created much of the problems that our inner cities now face. They'd rather be judged on their good intentions, not on the actual outcome of their policies. For activists and members of the media, for so-called civil rights leaders, to accept the truth is to accept some measure of blame for the mess we're in. And that's embarrassing. Those who have addictions, they say that the first step, the hardest step to getting cleaned up, is to accept that there is a problem in the first place. And there very definitely is a problem here. It's not a gun problem. It's not a poverty problem. It's not a racism problem. It's a sin problem. See, in many of America's urban areas, the poor and the downtrodden, and this has nothing to do with race, the poor and the downtrodden in these areas live lives of abject sin. And those sins span the whole spectrum of the commandments. I mean, you can just go through it. 70% of black children born out of wedlock. Sixth commandment. That means that generations of children grow up with no father in the home. That's a fourth commandment issue. They find their father figures in gangs, and their purpose and fulfillment in possessions and crime. They want, they desire, they covet things that they don't have and others do. That's the 9th and 10th commandments. They grow up with a love for money, sex, and personal pleasure above all things. That's the first commandment. They find it easier to steal or obtain what they want by false dealing rather than learning the value of hard work and getting a job. That's the 7th commandment. They defend and they expand their territory or their turf by means of violence. They get what they want. They break into people's homes. They carjack people. They rob people at gunpoint. That's a 5th commandment issue. And that sometimes means killing somebody just because you don't like how they looked at you. To the extent that they do go to church, many of these same gangbangers sit in the pews on Sunday to make mama or grandma happy, but then go out and indulge in lives of sex and drugs and violence on the other 6 days of the week. That's the 3rd commandment. Their mothers and their grandmothers pray that they'll change their ways, and they ultimately end up grieving when they end up dead. But then the blame is placed on guns or lax gun laws. But the real culprit is a society, a culture that has been created and fostered in these inner city areas, which has turned its back on God, where the family has been torn apart. It used to be the bedrock of those communities. That culture of despair and dependency has been maintained by politicians who promised every 2 to 4 years they're going to make things better, but they never do. They opt instead to keep those people poor and impoverished and dependent and voting for them. There is no love for your neighbor in maintaining such a system. It's just evil. And in the absence of those strong families and churches in our black urban communities, those were once the bedrock of those communities, we see sin coming in, and tens of thousands of young lives are lost to abortion, to crime and prison, to violence and death, and ultimately to damnation. Enough is enough. Instead of giving these criminals light sentences or paroling them early like one of the 2 men charged in the death of Nikia Aldridge, why don't we take the criminals off the street and lock them up and keep them there? Enough is enough. Instead of celebrating the art in music, movies, and television that celebrates this depravity, instead of partying with these quote-unquote artists, musicians, and actors who peddle this wickedness, instead of fundraising with them, maybe we should speak out against it. Enough is enough. Instead of calling for meaningless background checks, we should be expanding gun rights in places like Chicago. So people who are surrounded, the good people in those communities, and there are lots of them. The majority of the people in those communities are good people, but they're trapped. They're surrounded by drugs and gangs and violence, and they're left defenseless by their political masters in City Hall. Enough is enough. More than anything, pray for change. Pray for a change of hearts, that the Holy Spirit might work to bring healing and a renewed love for our fellow man. And pray ultimately for Christ to take us from this vale of tears unto him in heaven. Because enough is enough.
Your support is vital to this Christian-centered pro-gun ministry. Help support Armed Lutheran Radio by visiting patreon.com/Armed Lutheran and become a sponsor today. Up next, it's Mia's Motivations with Mia Anstine.
Hi there. I wanted to share a story. Today, my husband was out and about, and he ran into a tech that we deal with actually quite frequently. I wouldn't call him a friend, but we have known him for quite some time. Today, he and my husband were chatting, and the gentleman asked my husband how he could get his wife into shooting and maybe even into hunting. My husband was really excited because he sees this as an opportunity to make new friends that have a similar interest as us, as well as an opportunity to maybe give a possible newbie a positive experience. And honestly, that question that the tech asked, how do I get my wife involved? It's one that I've gotten quite often. I remember speaking on a women's panel at an archery show, and there were probably more men in the audience than there were women. It really did intrigue me because since it was a women's panel, I thought that there should be more women in the audience that were there to listen and ask questions. But guess what else? Most of those men that were in the audience asked the ladies on the panel questions on how to get the women in their lives involved or how to make their lives easier for the ones that were already involved in shooting sports or hunting. One way to get your wife or maybe even your daughter or friend involved is to include them. If you include them, they get a taste of what is going on, and they have an opportunity to ask questions, and they can decide for themselves whether it's going to be something that they might like to do or not. I have a few friends whose wives aren't against hunting, but they don't necessarily want to hunt themselves. They enjoy tagging along with their husbands on hunts, and they love having the organic meat. But an added bonus, if you do take them along with you, is you're spending quality husband-wife time together. So that's one way to get them involved. Take them out there. Another way that you might be able to get her interested is to find mentors. Find some of the women out there who are already involved in the sports that you like and you'd like her to like as well. Maybe it's 3-gun, maybe it's trap or sporting clays, or maybe it's even long-range shooting. I don't know what you guys like, but there are women in these fields that are great mentors. Follow them on social media, find their websites, find them on YouTube, and then share them with your wife. And maybe on a side note, let your wife know that you're not enamored by these women. Let her know, look at what this girl is doing, and hopefully she'll follow along and ask questions, and maybe she'll even want to become involved as well. I mentioned that I was speaking at that trade show, and do you go to trade shows? Take her along with you. Why weren't the women sitting with their husbands at that show? Take her with you and let her meet some of these women who are mentoring others. Many of these award-winning shooters and famous hunters, they are genuinely down-to-earth people. It's really nice to meet them and talk to them in person, and I tell you, most of them are really encouraging to others. It really is something that will help for your wife to see other women who are already involved in these activities. And on the topic of getting her involved, a lot of men try really hard and they have really good intentions. They want to teach their wives how to shoot, and oftentimes that doesn't turn out as wonderful as the good intending man had envisioned. The last tip that I will give you is to sign her up for a class. Take the time and look up and research women's firearms classes or groups. Find a class, find a camp, find something where she can go and participate and be involved, where the other women who are there learning are in her shoes. So, inclusion, mentors, and classes, go find it, and good luck. Be safe and always have fun.
So you have your concealed carry permit or license to carry. Now what? Now you need a good holster. Not one of those cheap neoprene prophylactic holsters you can buy in the big box stores. You need a holster custom built for the firearm you intend to carry every day. Check out cooksholsters.com. Made in the USA, Cooks holsters are available in a wide range of colors and designs for inside the waistband or outside waistband carry. They carry a lifetime warranty against defects and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Visit www.cooksholsters.com and use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST and take 15% off everything in the store. You put in the time and effort to legally carry a firearm for personal protection. Protect your firearm with a custom holster from cooksholsters.com.
You're listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.
Welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. We've been we were talking earlier about the nature of sin and evil. We've seen so many acts of depravity and evil in the last few years. Evil and wickedness are, of course, man's basic nature, and it's always been there. But with the advent of the 24-hour news cycle and the growth of media outlets and social media, not a day goes by when we're not confronted with mankind at its worst, from the personal, individual acts of violence and depravity to global acts of horror like ISIS. Now, our children are being raised in this new world of global media with access to news and images, the likes of which we were never exposed to in our younger years, depending on how old you are. In just the past 8 years, we've been confronted with riots and police killings, mass shootings, gang violence, terrorism, war, and the horrific executions of captives by ISIS. How do we explain these acts of evil and violence to our kids? Joining us to discuss this subject is Evan Gegline, pastor at Faith Lutheran Church in Rogue River, Oregon, and co-host of the long-running podcast Table Talk Radio. Pastor, thank you for joining us again today.
Thank you. And I'm the main talent of that show, too. Just wanted to stick that in there.
Oh, yes. I forgot to mention. That's absolutely right. The glue that holds it all together.
Hey, thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
What prompted me to ask you to join us today was an article by another Lutheran pastor, Hans Feeney, who's writing at The Federalist. He's the creator of the YouTube satirical videos Lutheran Satire. His article was about how to explain cop killers to kids, and that article struck a chord with me because Armed Lutheran Radio contributor Bill Silvia and his wife are both police officers, and they have 2 beautiful kids. So let's start with that particular question. After what we've seen with the targeted killings of police in Dallas and Baton Rouge and other places around the country, how would we explain to kids like Bill Silvia's little ones why someone, not just the average street criminal who gets confronted by a police officer when committing a crime or trying to escape, but the terrorist like the shooter in Dallas or the one in Baton Rouge, why would they want to intentionally target and kill their parents?
Well, first of all, I want to say that it's a good thing that we're engaging these topics with our children. I know our first, our initial reaction is to want to shield it from our children. We want to keep their innocence and things like this. And this all depends probably on age, but whenever it would be appropriate, I think it's good to talk about these things with our kids because they need to be learning how to deal with the realities of life. We don't want to just kind of keep them in a bubble, and then all of a sudden their bubble bursts, and now they realize this world is a dark and evil place. So it's good to, first of all, say it's good to engage these things. I think that the best way to talk about this with kids is in the context of talking about the fourth commandment. Now, every parent has the duty of teaching the commandments to our children, part of a Christian foundation of what the Christian faith is all about. And when we bump up into that fourth commandment, honor father and mother, and that's usually the first one parents teach their kids, the fourth commandment, honor father and mother. I mean, that's more important than you shouldn't steal, shouldn't lie. You might even teach that one before you misuse the name of the Lord your God. You're going to say, hey, you need to honor father and mother. So they get that one right away.
Right.
But when we talk about the fourth commandment, we're not just talking about mom and dad. We're also talking about other authorities. That we should fear and love God, so not despise parents and other authorities, but honor them, serve and obey them, love and cherish them. So when we're teaching them about the fourth commandment and other authorities, what we're learning is that the authorities are there on behalf of God, so that God could have designed it so that the human population continues on, procreation exists just by the stork coming and dropping a baby, or it could have been that he could have continued to create humanity out of the dust of the earth, but he didn't. He so designed it that there would be people to stand in for him, to teach children the difference between right and wrong, to teach children the Christian faith, and to bring them up in wisdom. And the people he set forward to do that is mom and dad. So that mom and dad stand as a representative of God for that child. And the same is going to be true then with the other authorities as well. The teacher stands in as a representative of God to teach. The police officer then stands in for God to keep order. And this is where the rubber is going to hit the road, because just as there are those who rebel against God, it would make sense then that they would rebel against his representatives. So there are those who actually hate the concept of God, and so it would make sense then that they're going to hate and even want to kill his representatives, including police officers. So I think you just explain to the child that there's bad people who rebel against God. They don't want to love God. We're all born this way. And some people will hate God to the extent that they will want to even attack those who represent him. So this is why it's important for mom and dad to do this great work of keeping us safe, to make sure that bad people can't do the bad things that they're trying to do. And it's an important job that mom and dad does to fulfill that task in society. The police officers have a job to do, just like the doctors have a job to do, construction workers have a job to do. And so you ask a child, okay, what is a police officer's job? And he'd probably say something like to get the bad guy or something like that. Right. And that's exactly right. I mean, that's what the officer puts on the uniform to do. That's what he trains to do. So when he steps into the office, as a police officer, his job is to enforce the law, whatever that means, arresting, issuing a citation, advising citizens of their options, whatever it might be. Now, how this helps us understand is that the criminal does not have some kind of a personal vendetta against Bob or John. They don't even know who Bob or John is. What they're attacking is the office. So they see someone who is there to arrest them, to enforce the laws, and they're despising that office. I mean, they don't care about the man. They're killing just because a person is wearing the uniform or driving the police car. So I think, again, that helps us teach our children. There are bad people who want to run away from the law, and they're going to hurt even good people who are trying to do good things. I mean, that's what a bad person, I'm speaking to a child, that's what a bad person does, bad things. And I think the kids get it. I mean, I think they understand. It's not that they hate mommy and daddy, they hate police officers.
Obviously, police officers do at times have to shoot civilians. They have to, and sometimes, unfortunately, they do shoot people who are innocent. How do we explain to a child so they don't fear the police?
Yeah.
like I was saying, there are some communities where the kids are sort of taught to be wary or fearful of police. How do we instill in children when they hear these stories, especially when so many in some communities are teaching this fear of police that, oh, they're out to get us? How do we reinforce in those children that they shouldn't be fearful of these people who are supposed to be working for our good?
Yeah, so last time we talked about the confines of authority, so that when someone is vested with authority, that there are certain things that they are allowed to do and certain things they are not allowed to do. Now, this is maybe confusing. I don't want to branch off into another conversation, but let's take a.
Oh, why not?
Yeah, but we will. Let's take so at the time being. We have certain people who are given the authority by the state to perform weddings. Okay. Now, up until a year ago, a person who's performing a wedding could only do so with a man and a woman who were not already married and who were not marrying someone like their sister, or unless you're like in certain states. Or there were certain limitations to whom you could marry. Right. Now, if a justice of the peace says, forget it. Even though you want to marry your sister, who am I to say that you can't do that? So I now pronounce you husband and wife. He has then acted outside of the bounds of his authority. He's not vested with the authority to pronounce a man and a woman who are brother and sister to be husband and wife. So obviously that authority did not act. I mean, that action was not being taken in the stead of the state. Okay. So the same thing would be true for police officers. They are vested with authority, and they can do so within the confines of what that authority is given them to do. And the authority is given to them to use lethal force if necessary in certain circumstances. And, it'd be interesting to have a police officer on to talk about the rules of engagement and when it is that an officer can deploy lethal force and what they have to look for and things like that. But that would be the boundaries. If a police officer sees nothing to resemble a weapon and nothing to indicate that he's going for a weapon, and he just decides to discharge his weapon at the suspect for no apparent reason of threat, then he's obviously acting outside of the authority. And now he's not acting as a police officer. He's now acting as a bad guy, and put it in the language of the kids. Right. So now we have to ask the question, is the police officer being a police officer, or is the police officer being a bad guy? And he has to act within the confines of his authority in order to make that distinction.
Well, and beyond the subject of cop killers, there's more than just cop killers and police shootings that our kids have to think about, and we should prepare our children for. Obviously, there's school shootings, and despite all the hyperventilation by the news media and activists, mass shootings are not on the rise. But as we discussed last week, the media keep these stories in our faces to keep people on edge. And schools are preparing for these rare but horrible shootings with regular lockdown drills that can be very worrisome for our children. So how do we talk to our kids? How do we explain to our children that somebody they don't know, somebody they've never met, might just show up at their school and want to actually kill them?
There is, I think, a risk in over-preparing. Now, I don't know. It's a sad reality that we see school shootings, and it really is. And we're always asking the question, as we talked about last week, what can we do? What's in the realm of our control? We would have it if we could to snap our fingers and there'd be no more school shootings. Unfortunately, that's not a reality. So we ask, well, what can we do? And so we teach the children, the students in the school, well, these are the little things that you can do to try to mitigate a situation when it arises. I think, first of all, we have to ask the question, what is a real possibility of happening? I think that's a fair question.
Right.
We see those prepper shows on TV where they're preparing for the nuclear fallout and all of this.
Right.
And sometimes I wonder, is this a real possibility of happening? I guess there's varying answers to that question, but I think starting with what are the real possibilities, and then secondly, just to ask, well, what can we do that would actually help? To prepare for things that aren't actually helpful is a big waste of time. So I think that first of all, we would start with what's a possibility and what would actually help. But I think in teaching our kids of, just like we would, what do you do when the fire alarm goes off? We teach kids, what do you do? But I also think that you would teach them, coinciding them, the first commandment, that we fear, love, and trust in God above all things. So that while we're preparing for something that could happen, we know that God's going to take care of us no matter what could happen. And that's where our ultimate trust is going to be, and is in God alone. So that now the child doesn't walk out of school that day in the greatest fear that this terrible bad thing's going to happen. The kid can know, I'm ready if something bad happens, but I know that God is taking care of us. And the big thing is that's going to have to come from the parents, right? I mean, don't count on your public school teacher to be teaching your kid about fearing in God. That's going to have to come from parent.
Right. So if your kid comes home from school and says, hey, we had a lockdown drill today and active shooter drill today, why would we have to prepare for this? Why are we doing this? How do you explain to them the concept of evil? We talked last week about sticking their head in sand and not being able to just ignore the evil that goes on in the world around us, and we can't shelter our kids from it completely. But when you're talking about a drill like a lockdown drill, where you're preparing for something that it may be rare, but it's possible that it could happen. Kids are naturally curious. Why are we doing that? The question may come up. Why would we need to do this? Why would somebody come to try to hurt us? How do you explain that kind of evil in a way that's comforting to your kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that this already fits into what I'm teaching my kids in the scriptures and the story of Christianity, because as I'm teaching my children the Bible stories, we already see embedded in the stories all kinds of evil and bad things that are happening. So this will be no stranger to them if they have, if you take some time to kind of teach them what the Bible is all about. And the biblical explanation for evil is the root of sin itself. So that God had intended for us to live free from all sin, and it was our own rebellion against God that brought death and darkness into this world. Now, there are those then who live and exist in this darkness and this evil, and even that we place to talk about the devil and the devil's attempts and work to continue evil among us. And so this is part of our language as we teach our kids about the Christian faith, that evil exists because of sin. Sin and death exist in this world. And yet what does God do about it? Well, oftentimes when we think about God doing something about evil, what we expect him to do is to kind of snap his fingers and make all evil cease in the world.
Right.
And this is the major question that a lot of people have. Well, if God really exists, why is there still evil in the world? Or why do bad things happen to good people? I think we want to be cautious with that approach to evil, though, because if you really want to ask the question, how does God define evil? Well, you're going to have to see anyone who falls below the standard of perfection in light of the Ten Commandments. And anyone that falls below that standard is evil. I mean, this also happened in the gospel where Jesus said, when your child asks for a loaf of bread, you don't give him a snake, do you? And then Jesus says, if you who are evil know how to provide for your children, how much your heavenly Father knows how to provide for you. Now, notice what Jesus just did. He's talking to his disciples, his followers, and he says, you guys who are evil can do this to your children. So we would fit the definition of evil. So if we expect God to snap his fingers and just rid the world of evil, that's going to include us. So what does God do about evil? Instead of just snapping his fingers and solving the problem of evil with his sheer might and strength, instead, God takes evil upon himself. He defeats evil not in the strength of might, but in lowliness and in weakness. He defeats evil by inviting evil upon himself, so that when we see Jesus doing his great work of redemption, it's one of lowliness. It's one of him being nailed to a wooden cross. It's where you see him lifeless and helpless, that there he is defeating evil. Well, how does he do that? Well, there he does away with all sin and all evil and all death, so to reunite, to redeem his fallen creation back to a holy and righteous God. And this is the wonderful thing for children then, to teach them that we would repent of our sins, as all people should, and believe in the forgiveness that Christ has won for us by his death on the cross.
And it gets back to that question that we talked about last week, where the letter that I got from the reader who said, if I own a gun for self-defense, does that mean my faith isn't strong enough, or, isn't it enough for me to trust in God to protect me? That's why we're having these lockdown drills where, God has given us the ability to defend ourselves, to protect ourselves, to come up with ways to counter evil in this world. He doesn't, like you said, he doesn't just step in and smite the evildoer as they come to the door. He gives us the ability to do it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, just as I mentioned before, just like when the fire alarm goes off, we don't just stare at it and go, oh, what do I do now?
How do I turn that off?
Yeah, well, it depends. If the one in the kitchen's going off, you do that, don't you? But normally, when the fire alarm goes off, there's a procedure. Okay, I know what to do. I mean, this is true with any kind of a training, right? They train the military, they train pilots, they train police officers what to do in this or that situation. And we can say, yeah, God has given me a brain. He's given me reason, and he's given me instructors to teach me what to do in this or that situation. The reality is that these things happen. We can't stop them from happening, but we can exercise the God-given reason that we have to help our neighbor in a bad situation.
All right, Pastor Evan Gegline is the pastor at Faith Lutheran Church in Rogue River, Oregon. He's the co-host of the long-running theological game show podcast at Table Talk Radio. Pastor, thank you for joining us again today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
You got it, anytime.
And that's going to wrap it up for this week. Thank you to our contributors. I am just so blessed. I have such a great cast of contributors helping with this podcast every week. Sergeant Bill Silvia, Aaron Israel, and Mia Anstine. And continued prayers for Pastor John Bennett, who is still dealing with some family medical issues. But Lord willing, he will be back with us next week. And thanks to Pastor Evan Gegline of Faith Lutheran Church in Rogue River, Oregon, for coming on the show again this week. And thank you, dear listener, for listening, downloading, and subscribing. I hope you will join us again next week. Until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Follow us on Twitter at Armed Lutheran. Check out the Facebook page at facebook.com/thearmedlutheran. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review on iTunes and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.